G'day guys and welcome, my name's Michael and I am the Deadaussiegamer, here to share with you my tips, tricks, ideas and strategies for playing and running tabletop role-playing games. Today we are back with another monster spotlight, today focusing on oozes, these formless creatures that we find lurking in dungeons and out in the wilderness, whose only drive appears to be the devouring of anything unfortunate enough to cross their path. But with these mindless creatures, is there more that we can do as a GM to throw these at our players? How better can we portray them when we encounter them in our games? Well, we're going to be discussing that today and looking at some of the ways that we can open up our thinking when it comes to handling oozes. So first of all, we need to look at what oozes represent for our games. Unlike say an orc or a wizard or goblins or any of these kind of creatures, oozes do not have motivation. They do not have a drive or a goal. Oozes are mindless creatures that slither, slime, roil, slop, I guess, through dungeons and areas, simply devouring everything. This can make it very difficult to place oozes in our campaign, because unless there is an intelligent mind sort of guiding why an ooze is in an area, such as a wizard trying to keep his dungeon spot and clean, or a particularly nasty looking torturer who maybe has a bucket of the creatures ready to torture his latest victims, there is no real reason for an ooze to be anywhere. Wandering into them in the wilderness is pretty random. It's about as random as coming across any other animal, really. Except oozes are created through magic and alchemy. So, you would not expect, for example, to be climbing at the top of a mountain on your way to go and speak to a Yeti chieftain atop the snowy ice caps of the Kolomandar Mountains and suddenly come across an ooze. You'd be like, okay, there's an ooze. It's cool, okay. There we go, done. But for me, I think those kind of treatments of ooze are throwaways. If an ooze is in your dungeon because you're running a pre-written module, it functions in that game like a trap, right? It functions like a pitfall or a slamming door or hell, even exploding runes. Oozes are trap-based monsters designed to spring, surprise, and ambush unsuspecting people. But I feel like there can be so much more than that. I feel like oozes step on a few places that I think only they can. The first is that these creatures are, by being mindless, motivated by nothing else. You can't feel resentment towards an ooze. Even if, say, your party members get ambushed by one, there is very little you can do to sort of really get hatred of oozes. I decided to explore this idea with a group of people, and this is going to actually get pretty sad. So I want to clarify that there will be a happy ending after I tell you the story. So bear with me. A long time ago, I had a group of adventurers who were exploring a dungeon deep below a wizard's sort of spire. As they were exploring it, they went into the menagerie. The group consisted of a fighter, a bard, a cleric, and a ranger. The ranger, of course, having a pet companion, which was a leopard. So the group ended up walking through the dungeon, solving a whole bunch of puzzles, which was absolutely fantastic, and came across what appeared to be a holy fountain. Now, for one reason or another, the group had actually been besieged by a great thirst. A previous encounter had actually dehydrated them to the point where they were almost withered husks. And so this presented them a gentle reprieve. So they rushed over to the pool of water and they began to drink from it, which was, perfectly fine. It was absolutely normal water. And all of a sudden they hear a yowling sound, as nearby this pool of fresh, clean water was another pool. But this one, sadly, was a trapped one. Because the animal companion was, by arrangement with the player, an NPC who was being controlled by the GM, I rolled a percentage to see which one he went to drink at, because obviously if you've got 4 of your masters drinking at the one pool, there was not really room for the leopard. It was so thirsty, it was so desperate that it saw the other pool and simply went for it, which was in fact an ooze. There was this very heart-wrenching and gripping scene where the ooze basically grabbed hold of its paws, then grabbed hold of its face, And one thing led to another, and the poor animal sadly did not make it. This, however, was not the end of the animal, as throughout the adventure, at the very, very end, the group was presented with a choice, very similar to the Fable franchise, where they could either gain the treasure of the wizard's alcove, they could potentially undo the evil that a creature had done, or resurrect the fallen companion. And of course, they chose to resurrect the companion. So, but this ooze wasn't doing anything. This ooze was just minding its own business. And yeah, the animal fell into the encounter. It fell into the trap. Even once the animal was killed by the ooze, the ranger didn't feel angry. The ranger, like basically just was sad, and there was no animosity felt towards the ooze. They just, they killed it obviously, but there wasn't like this rage moment which you would obviously find if any other monster were to take out an animal companion. But that's the experience I had. And it got me thinking, if you can create a trap-based monster that simply is, right? That creates such a unique experience for your players. Because a ooze can't be tortured, an ooze can't be interrogated, an ooze can't be coerced, right? It is just a thing that is a endless hunger. And that as an encounter is very unique. So where do we go from here? How do we better use oozes in our game? Well, the first thing I always say is describe what it is in as descriptive and as narrative a way as you can. The very common way to describe an ooze is that you come across a wall. It seems to be shimmering as if a liquid was being held back by an invisible barrier. Floating within it, you see a key. This is very common because obviously it's an ooze with a key floating into it, and it's a bit old hat nowadays. But I feel that there is so much more you can do in terms of texture, makeup, and of course sensations as you are approaching an ooze. Let's take the same ooze, a gelatinous cube, very common type ooze that is a cube-shaped type creature that, eats everything it has. As you walk down the corridor and find yourself in a large and open room, you see that there is a square foot of solid mass that seems to roil and wobble, reflecting on a sheened surface the light that seems to be hanging from the ceiling. In addition, there is kind of this astringent smell, almost like a chemical smell, maybe some bleach. You're not quite sure. As you look in the center of this wobbling mass, there does indeed appear to be a old king sitting in his seat, his throne made of stone and his armor tarnished while it clings to the skeletal bones. His hand holding, clutched in his fist, a large golden key. As you approach, the mass seems to almost expand toward you, growing larger and stretching forward. As you take a step back, it recoils almost like a rubber band reaching the end of its elasticity and returning to its form. Now, these kind of things, the elasticity, the texture, the shine, all of this stuff helps build up the type of ooze you're dealing with. Because the one thing that separates ooze more than the CR challenge, more than the numbers and all of that crunchy stuff we do, is what it is made of. What is your ooze made of? Is it made of jelly? Is it made of tar? Is it made of gunpowder? Is it made of tiny little nanobots for your science fiction adventure? What is your ooze comprised of? Recently, I played a game of Strange Aeons where we came across a hungry flesh, which was literally this Cronenberg thing that was just roiling flesh in bits and pieces. It was disgusting, absolutely disgusting, but I loved being able to describe it because it was such a unique type of ooze. So by exploring what your ooze is made of, you can then begin to explore how to communicate that with your party. You don't need to deceive them, right? They don't need to be unaware that an ooze is going to attack them. Oozes are super dangerous. And simply being in the way or being something that they need to deal with is enough, like in that example with the king. In one case, the key was in the corridor and it was just a wall of water. It was supposed to deceive the players into thinking that you can reach into the water and then pull out the key, not realizing that in fact these things are incredibly sticky and you would get stuck. The king, however, it's very clear that's a giant jelly. That's a giant ooze, no doubt about it. It doesn't change the fact that the group needs to deal with it. This could be they throw a fireball at it, they tie a lasso and throw it in and pull out the key, whatever. The important factor here is that the ooze has been kind of created as part of the narrative and not just thrown in as a stock standard, oh, yep, cool, you're done with the ooze, now let's keep going. All right. Lastly, the one thing I want to look at is how do you attack an ooze? Now, oozes are amorphous and formless creatures. As such, they do not have an anatomy of sorts where they don't have organs, they don't have vulnerable spots. Therefore, they are generally immune to things like critical hits or severe sneak attack damage, things like that. I feel, when I think of oozes, that oozes should have a way of overcoming them if you are going to take a direct approach. If you are looking at, just say, well, here's a good example, Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest is a great example. In Dragon Quest, low-level monsters called slimes are oozes that are usually immune to one type of damage. This could be physical damage, magic damage, fire damage, element, whatever. And at low levels, that can be killer, especially if you don't have the right element to deal with. You suddenly come across a whole bunch of magic-resistant oozes, and all you've got are mages, you're in a bit of trouble. In the same way, oozes can be treated the same way in RPGs. So if you pull out your sword, your friend pulls out his warhammer, and another friend pulls out his bow and arrow, and you've got one wizard, and you go, well, I want this ooze to really make the wizard shine today. I feel like the wizard has really sat back for a lot of this dungeon, so the ooze is going to have a DR, or a damage resistance, against the other people who are doing physical damage. And in fact, I'm going to make it a little bit harder and say that every time he gets slashed, if he takes a certain amount of damage, he actually splits into a second ooze. This may seem pretty harsh and may seem like it punishes the players who have, sort of specialized in a particular way. I'm not saying to, victimize the players. I'm saying you go back and forth, like try some that are resistant to magic, try some that are resistant to physical stuff. Play around with this idea, and you'll find that the oozes can suddenly become this very interesting way to shine a spotlight on particular play styles within your group dynamic. I remember I had an incident where I had a player who was playing a monk, and he was a pacifist monk. Right? Now, I know some of you are already groaning, but you know what? You can do a pacifist monk if you try. Maybe I'll do a video on that. But everything we came across, he would not kill anything. He would barely hit anything because he didn't want to cause pain. He didn't want to hurt the living creatures. He'd be fine with the undead, and when it came to oozes, he was fine as well. So it got to that point where everyone in the party was already frustrated because, this guy was useless 90% of the time. But we ended up fighting an ooze, we got stuck into it, he pulled us out, and he basically just bludgeoned this thing to death. And it was perfect because that's exactly how you killed it. This was a fantastic use of oozes in that campaign. Because not only was it a reasonable challenge that had a great narrative story, it was in a dungeon cleaning. That was it. It was just floating around, sucking up all the dirt and grime. And that's why this entire dungeon was pristine and clean. We had accidentally, gotten bored and tired of trying to follow it as it street swept its way through the dungeon. So we tried to kill it. Sadly, when we tried to kill it, it then split, it then grabbed us, it then did a whole bunch of horrible things. I think it was an ochre jelly. Yeah, if I remember correctly. And so the monk just came in and just flurry of blows this thing to death. It was fantastic. It was amazing. And even though we don't remember the ooze from that incident, we remember what the monk did. And that's the important thing. So with that, the last thing I'm going to leave you guys with is customize your oozes, right? Don't be afraid to change their shape, change their size, change where they are. Is your ooze a single large solitary creature? Or maybe it's a swarm of smaller oozes. Whatever have you, find a way to make the ooze work for what you're trying to achieve. I think the best thing to do is, take that time to really appreciate the fact that the oozes, while they may not have motivation, while they may not have a goal, they are relentless. They do not tire, they do not sleep, they do not breathe, And hell, they don't even need to eat in order to sustain themselves. They just keep going and going and going, and that in itself can be absolutely terrifying. Alright guys, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Go check us out on all of our other cool stuff. We have our Twitch now, we have our Patreon, we have Facebook, we have a whole bunch of things. Come say hi on Discord, because then you can offer me suggestions on how you want me to run my shows, and of course, what videos you'd like me to produce next. And of course, guys, as always, till the next time we see each other, game hard or die trying. See ya!